Good morning to you all and welcome to our fifth India-China Luncheon Lecture entitled today, China's Evolution under Xi Jinping, an Indian Perspective. We have changed our approach a little bit today. Our lectures have focused so far on the India-China relation and its various dimensions. This morning, or perhaps this afternoon, for those of you following us from India, we will examine how China, and more specifically, Xi Jinping China, as analyzed and understood from India. So our focus will be more China, although of course, this will tell us probably a lot about India and the way it looks at its giant neighbors. It may also in the process underline our real convergence of interest with India and our real convergence of view. Well, there might be some difference, of course, but this convergence might be of particular interest for some of you involved in the decision-making process, among others. So of particular interest will be to see how the domestic evolution of China has affected its foreign policy and the way it is actually impacting not just China's relation with the US, but also ongoing events. And I'm referring obviously to the war in Ukraine and the invasion by Russia. To help us understand the intricacies of Chinese politics, we do have the real privilege this morning to welcome Mr. Jayadeva Ranade, who is currently president of the Center for China Analysis and Strategy. Mr. Ranade is also a member of a number of important Indian institutions dealing with China, and I certainly won't name them all today. But prior to his think tank career, he has had a long and very distinguished career in government, from which he retired as additional secretary in Cabinet Secretariat. He's also been a member of National Security Advisory Board, and therefore is highly qualified, not just on China, which he has been watching for more than 40 years now, but also from the political processes and the way government work in relation with their neighbors. So, and I would not stop without mentioning that he is also an author who has written 3 books on China. The last one entitled Xi Jinping, China's Third New Era, which has been released last month. So nobody could be more qualified to address our topic of the day. And with no further ado, dear Jay, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Frédéric. And warm greetings from India to all of you and to the European Council on Foreign Relations. It's a very sensitive time, shall I say, for some people, or it's a very volatile time to be here and to be talking about China. A country which today is so large that it has involvement in almost everything that is happening around the world. But let me give you quickly, within the short time, a perspective on how we in India have been looking at China and look at it today. We are neighbors, as you all know. We have a very long unsettled border, 4,750 kilometers. Which has been contested by China in large chunks. We've also had a fractious relationship, and despite our proximity, some of us, or some of our leaders and some of us, have made mistakes in actually deciphering China's intentions. But that's another matter. Things have come to light on that. Let me get down to how we are looking at China, particularly China under Xi Jinping, because I think he is a different kind of leader who has emerged on the scene, one who is trying to set the agenda for all of us, for the rest of the world. And let me come down to a few points. First, of course, is that the rise of the People's Republic of China has been steady. From Mao wanting China to be able to stand up to the threats from the 2, in those days, atomic powers, namely Russia and the United States, to Deng Xiaoping's vision of modernization, and to Xi Jinping's ambition to make China a strong nation with pioneering global influence. The last phrase, pioneering global influence, actually is a euphemism for acquiring the ability to create international organizations or to mold the existing international organizations to suit Chinese interests. The rest of the world, however, did not take China seriously for a very long time. And even when it was gaining strength and started flexing its might, the major world powers, or for that matter, the rest of the world, chose to place profit over circumspection and help China to grow to this present stage. Today, it is a challenge for most countries. Let me just cut to Xi Jinping's arrival on the scene, which was at the 18th Party Congress in 2012. He was appointed to the 3 posts of General Secretary of the Chinese Communist Party Central Committee, Chairman of the Military Commission, and President of China for the first time after a gap of 30 years altogether. And I think a main reason for this was that the Congress was held after a tumultuous 1 year when Po Xilai, the son of one of the 8 immortals, Po Yipo, made a bid for the top posts and to oust Xi Jinping from the running. Finally, Xi Jinping was appointed to these posts, and that also, in a way, set the agenda for what he began doing later. But let me preface that by saying that when Xi Jinping took over, his predecessor, Hu Jintao, had already signaled that he felt that China had become fairly strong, and he had signaled China's confidence in itself by talking about the new type of big power relations. He was raising this with the United States. It became almost a mantra to be recited by Chinese leaders, but Hu Jintao was smart enough to realize that China had probably not yet reached the level that he wanted it to, and therefore, before his last visit to the United States to meet the president of that country, he dropped this plea and to recommend that the two become arbiters of the world. On taking over, Xi Jinping, who was a princeling, was confident of his lineage and what he believed to be China's destiny. I had mentioned that he came after a year of turmoil, political turmoil, and what he did was he began infusing large doses of nationalism and ideology into Chinese society. At the 18th Party Congress, he also articulated his ambition for China, namely the China Dream. And this comprises 3 parts. I'm not going to detail them, but let me just in passing mention, these were to make the people wealthy, make the Chinese nation strong, and achieve what he called the rejuvenation of the great Chinese nation. And that is where China's neighbors had a problem, because this rejuvenation implied the recovery of territories that China claimed and which it thought had been taken from China by the imposition of unequal treaties by hostile foreign powers. As far as India is concerned, large chunks of territory were at stake and are at stake, including our state of Arunachal Pradesh in the east. But I think a mental makeup of a leader is important, particularly of leaders of countries like China, which are authoritarian, some may even call it dictatorial, a one-man show, literally, and his mental makeup is important to understand as we all deal with him. Remember, he joined the Chinese Communist Party after having seen the sufferings that his close family members went through. His father was purged, despite being a close friend of Mao's, on 2 occasions. His mother was humiliated and physically beaten in front of him. His elder sister committed suicide because of the torture she went through during the Cultural Revolution. He himself was sent out to the countryside and shangfad, or had to go and work in a farm. Despite all this, and unlike his colleagues, he did not join the state-owned enterprises. and neither did he go abroad. He, in fact, joined the Chinese Communist Party. And I stress the fact that at the time that he joined, he did not really have a protector at the top. Neither was his father around, and nor at that time was Deng Xiaoping in power. Deng Xiaoping was a friend of his father's, finally was able to rehabilitate him, but at that time he was not. Xi Jinping, when he took over, he made a couple of things apparent right away. In fact, on the second day of taking over, at an enlarged meeting of the Chinese Military Commission. But what he made clear was that political loyalty and reliability would be paramount, and they would be the determining criteria for promotions in the People's Liberation Army, the Chinese Communist Party, and the government. He also did something extremely unusual for political leaders, which is he began tackling the three pillars of power, namely the army, the party, and the government simultaneously. A risky proposition by any stretch of imagination. But it was at this time that he undertook the most far-reaching reorganization and restructuring of the People's Liberation Army that it had seen in its history. He also undertook a rectification of the party. At that time, many party members felt that he was going back into a cultural revolution mode by asking people to supervise party members and party cadres. And he began an overhaul of the state-owned enterprises. This last included setting up of party offices in the state-owned enterprises and private enterprises. Except in the state-owned enterprises, where progress has been glacial, as far as the rest are concerned, the results have been quick and sharp. Reflecting his self-confidence, the changes that he began introducing since 2013 have been fast-paced and definitive. He has consolidated more power than any other leader, communist leader in China, and today is chairman of at least 19 central small leading groups, which are the most powerful bodies in China, and oversees areas ranging from modernization, control of the PLA, to economic reform, foreign and security affairs, and of course, what the Chinese Communist Party calls its magic weapon, the United Front. Therefore, he is called the chairman of everything. To achieve this and to be able to push through the reorganization and rectification of the Chinese Communist Party, he reactivated the party's anti-corruption watchdog, the Central Discipline Inspection Commission. And he placed his probably closest friend and confidant, Wang Qishan, as chairman of this Central Discipline Inspection Commission. Together, they initiated what has been the longest and probably the most vigorous campaign against corruption in the PRC's history. Its remit has expanded as time progressed. And before the end of his first term, just to illustrate the point about how he has used it, Xi Jinping brought down over 150 major generals and above, and 4,885, or almost 40% of the PLA's officer corps on charges of corruption and various violations of discipline. He also brought down 176 cadres of the government. Cadres meaning officials of the level of vice minister and above. Otherwise, of course, there are over 1 million who have been disciplined according to official accounts. But while Xi Jinping has been decisive, he has also been, to my mind, a bit impetuous, in the sense that he probably did not have adequate feedback of what his real strength is. And as people who've been studying China for years know, that estimates in China are actually guess estimates. It's sort of like a fistful of sand picked up by an official at the lowest level and an estimate given to his senior, who probably does the same, and up the ladder. So at the 19th Party Congress, Xi Jinping announced three ambitions for the country and his own goals. These were the China Dream, which he had spoken about earlier, and he set the deadline for its achievement by 2021, which was last year. which could explain why there was a more aggressive policy followed by him last year in strategic and foreign policy affairs. The second was, and the reason was because it was the Chinese Communist Party's 100th anniversary. He wanted to begin the reunification by that time. The second was the Made in China, which was to be completed by 2025. And the aim was to make China among the world's most advanced technology powers. The third was to make China a major power with global pioneering influence by 2049, or the centenary year of the People's Republic of China. He also used the occasion to underscore China's potential global leadership role when he said, when he proposed a community of common destiny. Now, this is a very well-crafted phrase. It could mean different things to different people, but by and large, people have viewed it as meaning a community of common destiny under Chinese leadership. But by doing so, by making these announcements, what he did effectively was he put the United States on notice directly. And Washington's response came within a couple of months. That was either planned or it was coincidental. But a feeling had been building up in the United States, in any case, that China was becoming a challenge and China had to be contained. It was a challenge to the primacy of the United States. This response from the United States came in the form of the trade war. And the first signs, which I noticed, were its targeting of the Made in China policy, which is the technology program. And the United States began battening down on supplies of vital spares and essential components to Chinese IT companies, particularly companies like ZTE and Huawei, both well-known names. ZTE was brought down on its knees. It was virtually bankrupt. Huawei managed to struggle on, but it was at this time, and I would like to make a mention here, that even Ren Zhengfei, the founder of Huawei, after blustering and probably bluffing for a while that Huawei would be able to overcome this and go back to being a leading IT company with the world ambitions, had to finally admit that most of the chips, microchips, etc., were brought from the United States. This message reached the leadership only when Huawei got into trouble. And I think it would have come to them as a shock. But because of all this, and because the US signaled that it was willing to go further on other matters, with the incarceration of Meng Wanzhou, Ren Zhengfei's daughter in Canada, unusual step to take, I think the message to China was very clear that US-China relations are heading downhill. China itself at that time, its economy began going into trouble, getting into trouble, and after COVID, it has had a rough time. It didn't announce a GDP growth rate figure, as you all recall, for a year. Now they've announced 5.5. That also some people say is an overestimate. But if we look at its economy itself, we find a 14% unemployment rate among the graduates who complain that they can't find jobs. We find that the targets, growth rate targets of almost every province in China has been lowered. We find that salary cuts have been effected in at least 17 of China's provinces, including the more prosperous provinces on the eastern seaboard, etc. Except for this year, for the last 2 years, the budgets of every ministry were cut, except, of course, the public security bill. So that is how we are seeing China progress. And the period from mid-June 2013 till about the end of 2020 and even beyond, that means till today, has been described by Xi Jinping's acolytes as China's third new era. Frédéric, you referred to my latest book. The title of that is actually borrowed from this. And they said it's a third new era because it follows those of the earlier two, the first being that of Mao and the second being that of Tang. And this, they said, in 2013, So the target for Xi Jinping's stature, rise in stature, his ambitions, etc., were evident and discernible even then. Xi Jinping's what Xi Jinping has also been doing in this period is almost a reversion to communist orthodoxy, but it is with soft overtones, cosmetic overtones, because he does not want to arouse adverse reaction. This period has also been witness to Xi Jinping hyping nationalist sentiment and ensuring the Chinese Communist Party's supervision and supervision over all sections of the state and society. As he declared, party, government, military, civilian, and academic, east, west, south, north, and center, the party leads everything. I mean, he's left nothing ambiguous here. And this became quickly apparent in the academic sphere, which they have been targeting, particularly since Xi Jinping came, as the source, or the, shall I say, the font of Western liberal ideas coming in and poisoning the minds of the youth, as well as the young recruits to the People's Liberation Army, who are increasing in number college graduates. Students' files were recruited. Lectures were monitored by the presence of a party cadre in classrooms. Lecturers and professors were also being monitored to see whether they spread Western liberal ideas. And ideology classes, or what are called party education, political education classes, were made mandatory for students as well as them. Ubiquitous surveillance systems like the social responsibility system were brought in. What actually he has done, if I may put it, is that he has ushered in a period of what I would call techno-Maoism. You know, it is Maoism, but through technology. It is in this context of Xi Jinping's ambitions and his strategic expansion that he has been pushing that we need to look at the Belt and Road Initiative and the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. The Belt and Road Initiative was, of course, as we all know, a very expansive project, initially a $1.5 trillion ambitious project, which actually meant linking production centers in China with natural resource and markets abroad over a China-built communications pathway. Later on, he added digital digital belt and road also to this, and then a maritime road and maritime Silk Route in order to expand Chinese presence all over. Europe was targeted because he perceived it, the Chinese perceived it as the repository of technology. And that is why we notice over the years an attempt to divide Europe, weaken the cohesiveness of Europe, and start purchasing or taking over the national debt of countries like Hungary, Greece, etc., in order to acquire a foothold. They also began trying to purchase European technology companies, almost succeeded in a couple of cases before the authorities stepped in. For us, of course, the Belt and Road Initiative had a direct impact. It went through territories that were Indian territories, but were claimed by either China or Pakistan, or in Pakistan's occupation. And then, as if to rub salt in wounds, they asked us to join it, which of course we refused. But behind the scenes, or not immediately noticeable by most people, it was noticed by us, was the creation of the Western Theatre Command, the largest military theatre command in China, with the largest armed force available to it. And its tasks included not only safeguarding the borders, but also the borders with Afghanistan, Pakistan, India, and protecting the assets and Chinese personnel working on the CPEC, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. The PLA Navy has also grown very rapidly, And we find today its presence, near permanent presence, I would say, or at least a regular presence. There is a near permanent presence in the Indian Ocean and the South China Sea. There is a regular presence in all the others, Atlantic Ocean, Pacific, the Bering Sea, the Baltics, the English Channel, etc. Because China sees the South China Sea, the Pacific and the Indian Ocean actually as a continuum, which is why we see about 47 ports being upgraded or developed by China in Africa alone, another 78 around the world, which they are investing in, either again by deepening them or upgrading them or even constructing them. So obviously, China has large ambitions. They have at the present only one overseas base, which is Djibouti, but they have two more in the works. Karachi, which is described in Chinese military literature as a naval base, and Gwadar as a naval logistics base. However, despite all this, despite all what Xi Jinping has done in the external sphere, internally, there has been an outpouring of criticism against Xi Jinping personally and the Chinese Communist Party that has not been seen since the Tiananmen uprising or revolt or protest, whatever you want to call it. It was first sparked by the decision of Xi Jinping to ignore the age limits that had been informally accepted by the party leadership and appoint people for more than one term, or people who had crossed 65 years, which was the age limit for them entering senior bodies. There was a lot of unhappiness. Many of the party members are people who survived the Cultural Revolution or who suffered during that time, and they made their opposition quite clear. Some of them even said that, we have been through or lived through Mao's one-man rule and we don't want to revert to it. And there were a number of letters posted on the WeChat and otherwise circulating. The 19th Party Congress in 2017 approved the term, thereby making a number of people feel that Xi Jinping is preparing for a lifelong tenure, if not a third term at the next Party Congress. This resentment, while he was trying to tamp it down through his security apparatus, got a fresh burst after COVID. The people felt there was a mishandling of COVID in the initial stages and they reacted. There were calls for him to step down. Again, there was a lot of criticism, and Xi Jinping reacted by imposing even more stringent security measures. And at this time, calls for reform made by private entrepreneurs and businessmen, including by other princeling, were ignored. In fact, one princeling, Ran Chichiang, had also called for reforms. He had been critical of Xi Jinping. He had got away so far because he was a princeling. But Xi Jinping decided to make an example of him and gave him the stiffest prison sentence awarded yet, after Deng Xiaoping's term. And despite pleas by other princelings that he should be let go. So he did have his revenge ultimately. He also set up a new outfit in April 2020 called the Safe China Construction Coordinating Small Group. It was staffed by his chosen loyalists, and its task was to prevent activities that danger the political security of the country and prevent, and I quote, activities that threaten the party center. In other words, activities that threaten him. It was also at this time when this was being set up that one of the vice ministers of security advised Xi Jinping that they need to tighten the controls on Politburo Standing Committee and Politburo members by restricting their right to appoint people and their financial powers. It was also from this time that they began providing security to the retired veterans, because these were the categories, or these were the categories of cadres who could pose a threat to Xi Jinping's continuance. As I said, the aggressive policies Xi Jinping followed have made all of China's neighbors wary. Vietnam, Japan, and India have suffered acts of Chinese aggression. We are currently facing up to China. And here I might mention, particularly for your audience, Frédéric, that in April 2020, when they came in large numbers, we reacted and blocked them. But they have entered certain territories, and we are now trying to get them back. There is a presence of over 50,000, estimates are 50 to 60,000 armed Chinese personnel on our borders. We, of course, have built up a counterforce. And there's a lot of construction activity going on, new airports, etc., and missile sites. The 14th five-year plan has even more ambitious plans for building up border defense in China. I don't have much time, I see, so let me just come down to the crisis in Ukraine. That's relevant to all of us. And here there are 2-3 points that really come to mind. The first is the friendship, personal relationship that Xi Jinping has been building with Putin over time. Their relationship has increased. The only comprehensive strategic partnership of cooperation that China has with any country, it tops the list of their 8 strategic partnerships, is with Russia. The other exception is Pakistan, which is an all-weather strategic partnership. So these are the 2 that China has, which are special. And here, when we view, with the benefit of hindsight, of course, Putin's visit to Beijing on February 4, it was unusual in the sense that for Putin to come out, he had not been traveling very much after COVID, but he came, made an exception, came to Beijing. The Beijing Winter Olympics were the excuse. It was a show of support also to Xi Jinping. The Chinese put him up in the Tianyutai State Guest House. There were only 2 others there. Everyone else was in hotels. So there's another sort of preference given to him. And there, at the in the joint statement that came out, it was very clear that they had had lengthy discussions on regional affairs and international affairs. Now, that was the language used. The implication was that they also discussed European affairs. Putin himself, of course, expressed support to China's stance on Taiwan, etc. Ukraine was not specifically mentioned. But a day later, there was an article, a lengthy article, which was published in the Chinese media and on WeChat, saying that this joint statement between China and Russia was actually, and I quote, an anti-hegemony struggle, unquote, statement. So the import of that was very clear. They both also expressed their concerns about color revolutions, which is worrying both of them. And implicitly is sort of a justification of what Putin did. But to me, at least, it is very, very unlikely that Putin did not brief Xi Jinping on what his plans were. He may not have done so in full, but he certainly gave him more than a fair idea of what is likely to happen, which is why we see China's prompt support to Putin on the 24th, when he actually decided to walk into Ukraine. Well, for Putin, it hasn't been an easy walk either. And the US and the West have reacted very strongly with sanctions. What happens in the days to come, whether Ukraine becomes, as I fear it might, an Afghanistan for Europe, a sort of crucible of incessant fighting, or whether it is resolved, time will tell, we will see. But at the moment, Putin seems to be, his progress seems to be much slower than probably what he anticipated. And that is causing difficulty for Xi Jinping, because the longer it progresses, the more worried he gets that these sanctions could be extended to him, either as secondary sanctions or as direct sanctions. The Chinese, mind you, are aware that the United States is going to focus on China, if not straight away, maybe once it settles the problem with Russia. Meanwhile, Chinese analysts have begun assessing the impact of the sanctions, how the Chinese could be impacted, and what they're doing. While officially words like invasion, war, etc. are not utilized, and the Russian version is what is brought out in the Chinese media, last week there were a few instances where they actually showed clips on Chinese central television of the damage being done in Ukraine. Those were unusual. One doesn't know whether that has continued. Not seen them in the last couple of days. But there is a kind of a feeling building up in China. And there are 3 or 4 instances that we've seen. One is a letter of protest by 5 Chinese professors of prestigious universities. Another is a letter of protest by 200 alumni of the prestigious Tsinghua University. Then there are Chinese academics who've been writing, siding with Ukraine and saying that this is the wrong step. Others who've been suggesting that China needs to cut its losses and take a clearer position, particularly one by that academic Hu Wei, who in fact said that within a week we should distance ourselves, otherwise we are going to be hit with sanctions. That is the worry. And here let me make 2 points before I start winding, which is that while Russia has been hit by the sanctions, maybe they were anticipating it. The Russian people, I don't think, are that interconnected with the West as the Chinese, or shall I say dependent in a way. In China, interconnectedness with the West is viewed as one of the signs of being a major power, China being a major power. The second and more important is that a number of Chinese send their children to the United States, Europe, UK, etc. for study. And a calculation done when Trump, during Trump's time, Pompeo announced that a scrutiny and ban on visas to Communist Party members, Chinese Communist Party members was on the cards. There was panic within the Chinese Communist Party. There was a lot of, inner party traffic expressing apprehension, because by estimates at that time, by party insiders, almost 300 million party cadres and members would be affected directly. Either their children or their relatives' children would be impacted. So I think the Chinese are quite sensitive to this. They also know that they have been benefiting from the Western markets. A study done by the Chinese Institutes of Contemporary International Relations, which is the think tank for the Ministry of State Security, they assessed just after the outbreak of COVID and all that happened at that time, including the poor quality of PPEs, etc., that the Chinese supplied. They said that anti-China sentiment was so high that they anticipated American and European markets being gradually closed off to China. And secondly, that the sentiment was so high that the Westerners could use it as a spark to create political turmoil inside China. That was also the assessment of the People's Liberation Army, strangely, in an editorial in the PLA daily. Finally, let me just conclude with a couple of sentences on China-India, because that directly impacts us. And I think we should mention to you that China's attitude and posture towards India has undergone a change. Since 2014, which coincides, of course, with Modi's advent, but the Chinese began feeling that India's international stature has risen. And we began seeking our place in organizations like the Nuclear Suppliers Group, etc. They also found that India had begun actively resisting their attempts at intrusion in the territories that they had claimed. And two instances I will mention. One was the 73-day standoff in 2017 when they came to Doklam. They violated an agreement signed in 2007, a tripartite agreement between China, Bhutan, and India, that no one would make a move in the Doklam Plateau without consulting the others. The Chinese unilaterally began building a road. We blocked them. There was a 73-day standoff. What was worth noting in that was that not a day passed without very shrill and very abusive, vitriolic, I would say, threats being made against India on each of those 73 days. After that, of course, there was a withdrawal. But here again, there's a bit of a twist in the tail, because when the withdrawal was announced simultaneously in Beijing and by India, a rumor swept across China that Xi Jinping had paid $1 billion to India to agree to the withdrawal. And this was officially denied by the PLA spokesman, by the Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesman, and by the Chinese Communist Party in the People's Daily, indicating that that rumor had swept across. The second was, as I referred to, the April 2020, when the Chinese, who were on an exercise and on their way back, suddenly ingressed India in large areas. And as I said, with massive force. We were able to build up a counter force quickly and block them. Later on, we pushed them back in a few areas, contained them in a few areas, and then talks are on. I personally don't see any prospect for the talks yielding anything. I think the Chinese will try and stay on where they are until we think of something else. And here again, I do invite your attention to an article, very detailed article written by a very senior fellow of the Chinese Institutes of Contemporary International Relations of the Ministry of State Security, where he said that this tension will remain, and he anticipated a situation of shove and push along the LAC by the two armies, leading to occasional firefights. He said till both reach a line which they feel is acceptable to the two sides. So in other words, as I preface this by saying that there will be, I anticipate, a period of very uneasy tension for a long time. And in conclusion, let me just say that with trust having been destroyed by the Chinese, it is going to take a very, very long time before things can get back to normal if they ever do. So I'll end on that note, Frédéric. I hope I haven't exceeded the time limit, and I hope I've given a sort of rough idea of how we see China. Thank you. You're on mute, Frédéric. You're on mute.
Yeah, sorry. I said, yes, you have exceeded the time, but that's okay because it was indeed a fascinating presentation. And thank you for a very broad and very detailed and documented presentation. I will not do what I usually do, which is start asking the first question, but turn immediately to the audience, because there is a question that we anticipated would come and that we will need to readdress, which is, how would you comment the distancing from sanctions on Russia by both China and India? What are the reasons and what are the key differences? And I believe this question relates actually to your two last points: attitude of China on India, attitude of China on Ukraine.
Yeah. Well, as I did mention about China, that there is an ideological affinity between China and Russia. Both Putin and Xi Jinping are creatures of their communist parties. In fact, probably Putin is from the inner core of the Chinese Communist Party, but both are. Xi Jinping is a princeling. He's grown up as a father who was one of the revolutionaries, one of the founder revolutionaries, if one could say, committed to the cause. And as I tried to bring out, he is trying to bring back Maoist philosophy in another form. I think this is what motivates them. The second is Xi Jinping's ambition to rival, if not surpass, the United States. And here he sees a situation where Putin is taking on the West and the United States. He is hoping that Putin is able to either hold his own or best the West in Ukraine. And then he will see. If things become bad, if Russia is not able to make any headway or has to eat humble pie and pull back, then of course things become difficult for Xi Jinping. It is, I think, to say that China will then become the dominant partner is a very facile argument, because to my mind, China is already the leading partner in the China-Russia relationship. So I don't think, just being the dominant partner will give any satisfaction to them. In fact, their worries will increase because they will now become the focus point in their mind of US and West's what they would feel is unwanted attention, because the ambition would be to then seriously contain them, an ambition which should have been there much earlier. The second, as far as India is concerned, as you said, why our position? It's very clear. One is, of course, that, well, let me just say that we have close relations with Russia and with Ukraine and with the United States. With all three, we don't want to spoil the relationships or the partnerships. But the key point is that with Russia, we are dependent on them for over 50%. I think it's between 55 to 60% of our defense equipment and spares come from Russia, and a number of them from Ukraine too. As you know, jet engines, turbos, etc., come from Ukraine for China and for India. In fact, here China's stance is interesting. China has signed a security agreement with Ukraine some years ago, where it undertook to protect Ukraine in case any power attacks it, with strategic weapons. We are seeing no signs of China trying to even stop that. So that's another instance, I would call it, of Chinese duplicity, but that's how it is. But as far as we are concerned, our aim is very simple. We want to safeguard our supply lines. And secondly, we do see a dichotomy when we find that Germany, UK, United States are continuing to buy oil from Russia, and us being told we should not. We find we are dependent on oil from external sources. We find that at the moment the prices have dipped. This is the time for us to buy, and we are doing it. We are not violating sanctions. And in fact, I would go a step further and say we are doing what everyone else is doing. So I don't see a dichotomy in our position, except that maybe had we been stronger, we could have leaned on Putin a bit more maybe, but otherwise we are sticking to what the UN Charter, etc. is. So India is conscious that the West is treating it and the United States treating it. It's a crisis in their backyard, and they certainly would like support. But these are our compulsions, which is why we are adopting the stance we are. And a final word, Frédéric, despite what the Chinese and Pakistanis say, our stand is not identical to theirs. We have different compulsions, which is why we are doing it.
Thank you very much, and the ECFR will be publishing a policy brief soon on this issue. Before we continue with the audience, let me just rebound to the first part of the question. You have underlined the ideological proximity between Putin and Xi Jinping. What about the national interest of China? We can, and it's not clear to a number of us what the benefits really are for China. We understand the convergence between Russia and China about the need to bring down the West as much as possible. We understand that the strength of the security partnership, but it also has a potential cost that you yourself underlined for China, which make us wonder about what is really China gaining into this. And as much as the situation was good with the crisis prior to the invasion, this is now a totally different ballgame. So how do you explain in this context the ongoing Chinese position. And that brings me to the second question in the audience by Denise Verret, which is 2 weeks ago, China's Foreign Minister Wang Li stated that China was prepared to contribute to the mediation on Ukraine in due time. What means in due time? What is China actually waiting for and why? And I believe these two are interconnected questions.
The short answer to what you asked is China is waiting to see what happens. They are hoping that Russia is able to achieve its objectives without things escalating, in which case China is in the happy position of continuing its partnership and having a strong Russia who will partner it in the Sea of Japan, in the South China Sea, in the Indian Ocean, etc. It'll be a strong, shall I say, it'll buttress China strongly. Secondly, China is dependent on aircraft engines, on military supplies, on Russia. They're also buying these same spare parts like turbofans and jets, etc., from Ukraine. So they're dependent on both. As I said, Russia has huge mineral resources too, particularly oil and gas, which China has taken advantage of to sign on good terms now a $10 billion project. But these are China's basic considerations, and I would quantify them as first is ideology. The second is balance of world power, where Russia, if it remains strong enough, would be a good partner for China, good ally. Third is the military supplies and natural resources that China gets from Russia. So these are the main needs. And of course, China does see that United States is its main threat, and it feels that the US views it accordingly. About the point about Wang Yi's comment, Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi's comment about being willing to mediate in this conflict. He also spoke to, I think, the EU High Commissioner for, I think, External Affairs, you call him, or Foreign Affairs, Mr. Borrell. And this matter was discussed some time back, I think 7th of March or so. But I understand from some sources that he also told him that if you want China to mediate, you first withdraw some sanctions against Russia. So that's the Chinese position.
We do have another question which is related to the consequence of this war on India. Is Russia more important than the Indo-Pacific, or is India too important that it does not need to worry about this? What if Russia's friendship brings China behind and India is squeezed? Is that something that you fear? Well, obviously, I would say yes. But I mean, to the first part of the question, I understand it as is the Russian partnership more important than the partnership with the US, or are you confident enough that because despite the Russia partnership, you will not have any problem in the relation with the US?
As I said, I don't look at it, and I don't think we look at it as an either-or situation, that is either Russia or the United States. We have invested a lot, and so have the Americans, in building up that relationship. And we certainly hope to take it forward. And that's our ambition. As far as Russia is concerned, we are very conscious, in fact, acutely conscious of the moves that Russia is making. You know, it's discussion with Pakistan, Imran Khan's visit to Moscow just before, I think it was 22nd or 23rd of February. And China, as I mentioned to you, is no friend of ours. I mean, in diplomatic language, maybe you don't call it an enemy. I'm not a diplomat, maybe I would, but it's certainly a very harsh adversary. And we are very conscious, therefore, that the Indo-Pacific, all that it embodies, may not be articulated, but all that it embodies is an important and crucial organization, which we need. Therefore, it is extremely important. How Russia fares in the Ukraine crisis will, I think, to a large extent determine the nature of the threat to us, whether it escalates or remains the same. That is the clearest I could give. If the threat, if Russia is humbled, or shall I say pushed back, regardless of whether Putin survives or not in such an eventuality, I think the Chinese, to my mind, may be a bit more careful because they would now have the United States and the West to contend with. But if Putin is able to hold on or arrive at some face-saving kind of formula, then Xi Jinping will assess what he can do. Right now, the Chinese military commanders and Xi Jinping, I think, are very closely monitoring the situation to see whether they can pull off something with Taiwan. That seems difficult because it's an amphibious operation. And seeing what's happening in Ukraine, I think they will not probably try anything.
To rebound perhaps on the previous question, is there a debate in India about the consequences of the Ukraine war for the Western commitment in the Indo-Pacific? How do you assess the consequences of this war from that perspective on your foreign policy?
There is a, let me reframe that a bit, Frédéric. There is a debate in India on the stance that we should take as the crisis or as the war in Ukraine continues. There is a feeling that if it gets prolonged beyond a point, then is it worth, walking this tightrope that we are doing today? So there is obviously one group which favors that we take a clear-cut position and, we side with the US and the West. There are, of course, old-timers whom I'm sure you're familiar with, who feel that, we should not ditch the Russians. So there is that debate going on. But but there is, I think, very little doubt in anyone's mind that China is our main concern. So how you feel that should come in, you see. But I think that as far as the United States is concerned, China is a threat to them, whether they call it that or not. It's a threat to us. And I think there is a convergence as far as the Indo-Pacific is concerned on that.
But let me ask you another question on this. This is very clear to some of us, at least, that between, in the sort of Asian triangle of China, Russia, India, Russia has clearly privileged its relation with China now over its relation with India. How long can you live with that? And now is the debate in India about whether you should or not continue this relationship with Russia, as you just mentioned, or is it about the process itself of decoupling from Russia?
Well,
which for a number of reasons may be extremely complex.
Decoupling will take a lot of time. As I said, we are dependent, much as I don't like to use that term, but we are dependent on Russia for a number of things on, in our defense, for a number of our defense needs. And that will take time for us to move away. A move has already started. We have already started diversifying sources of purchase of defense equipment. But there are certain areas where we are still tied in with them. And I think it will be a while before we can separate, unless, of course, something dramatic happens and, their factories just shut down. But short of that, I think that is what I would say. And I don't think, I think even others are looking at, as I said, a sub point of what I said, Russia's relationship with China, how close it is, how will that evolve in time to come. So we've got multiple problems looming on the horizon with this triangular relationship, if at all it can be called that.
So let's close this session with one last question, which is, what is your view of the coming visit from President Xi to India?
Let me be absolutely frank. I think it's a visit, which I have been all along, of course, but it is a visit which is designed to lull us into some kind of a complacency that China wants to improve relations, that China wants to look for commercial ties, etc. I think he will get a very formal, structured and courteous reception, and that's about it. He will meet, of course, our External Affairs Minister. He may meet our National Security Advisor because both of them are involved, as special representative for the border talks. But I don't think, and I certainly hope not, anyone else. And I don't see the relationship on the mend. As I said even earlier, the border issue has to be sorted out. Our External Affairs Minister and Foreign Secretary have made that assertion just in the last couple of weeks also.
Thank you very much, Jay. I mean, it's unfortunately time to bring this session to a close, but it's been fascinating. There were more questions coming up, one in particular about the quality of Russian armament, but I mean, this is something for a future session, and we will stop here today. Let me, on behalf of all the audience, on behalf of all of us, and on my behalf, by the way, thank you for your intervention. This was really interesting, and I guess we will continue this debate further on, but thank you for enlightening us. And to all of you, thank you for your presence and have a good day.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Frédéric, for inviting me. Thank you.